Welcome to this episode of Level with Emily, featuring a conversation with composer Maclaine Diemer about his music for Firmament. Firmament is the newest game from Cyan Worlds, who made Myst and Riven, two tremendously influential games from back in the 90s, and their sequels, various sequels. Firmament is not a sequel to those games, but does, of course, come from Cyan Worlds, so it's a puzzle adventure game in that vein. Beautiful landscapes, beautiful architecture, and phenomenal puzzles. Maclaine calls his music for the game ambient industrial, and that it is, in that it's ambient, it's very chill, it's very atmospheric, but it can be grimy and gritty at times as well. Handful of real acoustic is the word I'm looking for. Sorry, acoustic instruments that he uses, and he shows them in this video, which is really cool. He shows you a bunch of the different instruments that he used to create this fantastic soundtrack for this game. Please subscribe to this channel, give us a like and notifications and such. And if you can support us financially, do that at patreon.com/level. You can find us on Discord too. That link is in the show notes. All right, here's Maclaine Diemer talking about Firmament.
Well, first of all, it's lovely to see you again, Emily. Thank you for taking the time. It's always a pleasure.
Likewise.
Firmament is a new game that's coming out for VR and 2D, or like flat screen, I guess is what they call it, from Cyan Worlds, which is the studio that made Myst and Riven. And then they kind of, came back a few years ago after the Myst thing had sort of died down a bit with a game called Abduction, and this is their follow-up to that. So it's not a Myst game. It's not in that world, but it's cut from the same cloth. So it's a exploration, beautiful environment, sort of mystery puzzle solving game, and it's really gorgeous. It's really cool, and if you like any of their other games, then you're going to love this one.
Yeah, they just build such beautiful, colorful worlds with just amazing architecture, and you're just like, wow, I want to go in that building, and then you get to go in it, and it's really cool. Yes,
exactly.
Yeah, I love that stuff. And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but these games, the older games from the 90s in particular, Myst and Riven, were important to you personally, right?
Yes, absolutely. So maybe in our third or fourth meeting that I had with the studio, I told them, look, I'm not going to be a fanboy in every meeting, but, and I had to sort of continue to get all my Myst anecdotes out. But yeah, Myst was it's a Mount Rushmore game for me, right? It's Mario and Zelda, although the Game Boy versions of those, because I didn't have a NES or a Super NES because my parents wouldn't let me. Yeah, it's up there with those as far as I'm concerned for me, because it was the first game that I remember playing and feeling like a different emotion than just the adrenaline rush of I beat that level, I beat that boss. I remember having sort of complex feelings and saying like, what, as the mystery of it starts to unfold, thinking like, what is going on here, and not being, saying, oh, I'll just solve one more puzzle, or I just got to get to the end of this level, right? That sort of complexity of emotion of not knowing what's happening and really wanting to get to the end of it, almost like a good book, which ironically, books are such a huge part of the games.
Right.
But that's what it felt like. It unfolded like that, where it sort of becomes a downhill run where you say things start to click and you say, oh my God, I have to get to the next step of this because I have to know what's going on. And it was such a fundamental experience for me, only looking back in retrospect, because I was probably 14 or 15 when I played it originally. But not, it was the first thing where I felt like games is a storytelling medium, not just a little fun diversion, right?
Yes.
And so, yeah, it's truly important to me. And I've bought and rebought it so many times in so many different systems and formats. And I'll buy it, anytime they repackage it, I'll rebuy it.
Yeah, I had a cousin and an uncle who were really into it, and my cousin was too, in high school when Myst came out, and I remember them talking about it, and I remember them showing some of it to me. I also was not really allowed games. That's kind of an oversimplification, but also nails it. But I remember thinking, oh, this is like a game for adults. That was like my mentality when I saw it. And in hindsight, I can see why I thought that. But it really, talk about an immersive experience, right? At the time. I mean, just compared to so many other things. So all of that to say that these are games that are meaningful to you. And so you bring a certain, I think, emotion and understanding to the score that, you know, someone like me, who I didn't end up playing those games, wouldn't have that same relationship. So talk to me about, you know, the moment you knew, oh my gosh, I'm going to score this new game from Cyan Worlds, and where that took you musically.
Yeah, well, it started, as these always do, with a conversation with the creative heads of the studio to talk about what they wanted. You know, it, like I said, it's not a Myst game, so it doesn't have some of what I consider the signature aspects of that, which for most people is probably just like pizzicato strings. I mean, it's like it's so iconic. This sort of opening notes of some of the motifs that you hear repeatedly, and which is funny, sort of conveniently placed in view of my camera here. One of the first things I did was, even though I knew it wasn't a Myst game, I know how important it is to sort of carry on that legacy that of the studio, and a lot of those people are still there from the Myst and Riven days. And I thought, well, I gotta put some of that DNA into the music. So I did some research, and I found that Robin Miller, who's one of the two Miller brothers that founded Cyan, you know, he did a lot of the design, and he did all the music. And I was just trying to find some interviews with him where he talked about his process and all that. And I found something that said, I think it's an old GDC talk from maybe 10 years ago, where he did like a classic postmortem talking about it. And he said, originally the game wasn't going to have any music. And they realized that wasn't going to work, you know, as they were sort of getting along in development, but it was also getting down to crunch time. So he just sort of cranked something out. He said he wrote the whole score in 2 weeks. Right. And he did it all on this, not this exact one, but this model of keyboard. So this is an EMU Proteus Master Performance System plus Orchestral. It's kind of a mouthful. Yeah. Not very gracefully named, but there's sort of multiple iterations of the sounds that are in that keyboard. And I was finding cheaper options and easier options online to buy, like little rack mount units with no keys or anything. And I was like, I gotta find the real thing. I have to. And I was having a lot of trouble. I could only find them like in Europe or in Japan, and people were, you know, charging like what I think is absurd prices, because it's not a desirable keyboard. So I'm like, I'm not going to pay that much for, you know, this thing is kind of one step above a toy, but it has the essence in it, and I need that. Right. So then eventually I tracked someone down. I was looking like Craigslist, eBay, Facebook Marketplace, and eventually on offerup.com. I found someone somewhat local who had one for sale for a good price. And I drove, it was like a 45-minute drive to get there. And I whenever I'm in that situation, I'm so excited to buy something like that. I try not to like super geek out, because the person's selling it, they just want the money. They don't care. I'm like, but this is the keyboard that Myst was written on, you know, like this guy doesn't care. So I was trying not to be like that. But anyway, once I got it, I was like, oh my God. And then I started scrolling through the presets, because unlike a synthesizer where, you know, you sort of start from scratch and have to build your own sound, this is, forgive me for the tech talk, this is what they call a rompler, which is a sort of a portmanteau of ROM, and sampler. And it basically just means it's like a crappy sort of sampler. So the sounds are what they are, and they're very low resolution, low bit rate. But you can't change them. You know, there's no filter. There's none of the stuff we associate with pure sort of analog synthesis. Yeah. The sounds are what they are. So I'm scrolling through the presets and just banging on keys, like, okay, cool, next one. And then I'd get to one and be like, oh my God, this is the sound. And then I'd realize he didn't even do anything special with it. It was like, you know, there's like this one sort of phasey gong sound that, again, once you hear it, if you know the game, it's like iconic. It's just the sound in the keyboard. There's nothing special on it. And I thought, wow, okay, maybe I can like be a little nicer on myself if I'm using presets on my other keyboards. It's like, who cares? If it sounds good, then it works. Right. But so I went through it and I wrote down I have my little notebook here. I just, I didn't go through every patch, but I went through a bunch of them and was like, this is a missed sound. This is a missed sound. This is a missed sound.
Wow.
And then again, knowing that if I was going to put it in Firmament, that I would have to disguise it, but it has to be in there. So they're not on every track, but they're on a lot of them. And they're, heavily processed to the point where most people probably won't recognize it, but maybe I'll do some fun sort of behind the scenes thing eventually.
Yeah.
So that was my initial idea. I was like, it just has to start with that, and then let's warp it. And what I think works for the concept of the game is that I don't want to spoil anything. It's going to be very difficult to not spoil anything because the story, is the puzzles are part of it, but the uncovering of the story is a big part of why you would want to play the game. But there's this notion of messages, right, and sort of decaying sort of signals that you get from the ether that you're around or the environment that you're around, and that's how you start to piece together the story. And it ties into something that I've been obsessed with, and this is the first time I've had a chance to explore this idea for real, of what does music sound like if, let's say, you're planet Earth, you send out a signal, and 10 million light years away, you receive that signal. Well, there's no way it's going to get to you perfectly. So what does that sound like, and how do you interpret that? And it's an idea that I've wanted to explore based on other projects I've demoed for, things that got canceled, things that will never come to fruition. But it's an idea I've been kind of obsessed with for several years. And especially as I've slowly acquired, other electronic gear and synthesizer equipment and stuff, in my mind, there's been this thing building up, and finally, this is the game I've gotten to explore it on for real. So I'm very excited for people to hear that. I hope they like it. But yeah, it ties into that, and the idea of similar. I've been obsessed with the idea of do you know about the golden record that was on the Voyager satellite that they sent in the 70s?
Yeah, there's Bach on there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And Chuck Berry.
Yeah.
And so for people who aren't familiar, when NASA was sending out the Voyager satellites, knowing that these were never coming back, they fired them off into space with the intention of just seeing, getting them as far as they could possibly go. And what's amazing is that it's been, 45 years now, and they're still sending signals back to Earth, which is unbelievable. Yeah. But on one of I think it's the first one, they sent out literally a golden vinyl, or it's not a vinyl, it's made out of gold, but it's a record, right? It's an LP. Mm-hmm. And it has music on it, and it has speeches on it, and it has information that's encoded, imagery like representation of the man and a woman form and some other stuff. Mm-hmm. But the idea is that it's as simple as possible, so that if somebody finds it, they can kind of decode it and learn about Earth, right?
And learn how to play it, right? There's like instructions on how to make that record make sound too.
Yeah. Which is, a brilliant concept. It's so funny that it's on a record, but but that's the best we could do. And it's fully analog, right? There's no electronics required. Mm-hmm. So again, that idea. So the idea of, if you're the alien civilization and you receive that record and you hear it, to us we hear Chuck Berry and Bach and a speech. I forget what speech it is, but to them it's alien culture, right? So so just sort of playing with that idea of what does that sound like musically, and one of the references that I was given from the studio, ironically, was a Brian Eno album called Apollo, which came out in 1981, and is nominally about space exploration in the space program or whatever, but it's an Eno record, so it's all ambient and washed out and stuff, and I love it. It's in hindsight, I've learned that's one of his most famous records. I wasn't familiar with it because he's one of those guys that's so prolific that I just, eventually you have to sort of discover somebody for yourself. And I discovered Brian Eno at the age of 40 or at least this record, in 2022. But yeah, it just all kind of made sense. All these ideas were coalescing in my mind. I thought, oh, okay, great. These are all things I've been thinking about and waiting for. And this is finally the project where I'm going to get to explore them.
Yeah. And it's so very different than anything you've been able to explore, at least certainly things that we've talked about. You mentioned that some of these things you've explored on projects that haven't come to fruition, but the things that we've talked about, this is so different than those things. And I really love that. And it's just music that you can have on and it's pleasant. Like it's, well, I'll tell you for sure, in particular, Sun on St. Andrew. And in a lot of the tracks, everything shifts very slowly. There's nothing is abrupt. There's nothing epic about, when you think of the word epic in terms of video games anyway. Yeah. And it's just, reverby and lots of open intervals and just space, all these different ways that you're giving us the impression of just wide open space, and even pausing between chords to almost to a point of silence in some tracks, and I loved that slow shift that happens so often. So I can only imagine that takes some amount of restraint as a composer to write that way. Does it?
You would think so, but for me, that's just what comes naturally. And,
awesome.
and I've said this before. It's funny. I was texting with our mutual friend Austin Wintory yesterday because this will sort of timestamp this, but a new game that he worked on came out, and I was just saying congratulations. And it's sort of all combat music, and we were just, it's I probably said it too much, which is why my reputation precedes me. But this idea that I'm just not, I don't like that music, I don't really like writing it. I probably should stop saying it publicly because it is a part of the job. But we were kind of joking around about that. And I said, I've said this as a counterpoint to that. I'm like, the thing that I am good at, the stuff that just comes naturally, is slow and sad and pretty, right? It's just, that's just what comes out of me when I sit down at a piano. And maybe I said this the last time we talked, but I've learned over the years that my internal BPM is 70. That's just every time I start something and then I hit the little tap tempo button, it's always within a few clicks of 70. It's just where I sit. And so this was great because there's no combat music, right? And I just got to let these ideas sort of come out. And I've tried to do, and I have, but I've done stuff in that sense that's very slowly evolving and doesn't have a lot of flashy sort of tricks with Guild Wars. But with an orchestra, it's got to be interesting, right? I guess you can just have them play a chord, for forever. But when it's human beings making it, right, you're limited by the length of the bow and the breath capacity or the lung capacity of the wind players. There's certain things that force you to just keep things moving, right? The nature of the instrument.
Yes. With
electronics, it's much easier, for better or for worse. And then I also love this idea. This is another idea I've tried to explore when I can. The idea of, and this is not a revolutionary idea to me, but it's part of my creative process, letting the reverb and delay and effects be part of the instrument. So you play a sound, but it's so buried in stuff that you just let it trail away, and you have to clear everything out because I want you to be listening until the absolute last possible second, right? Because there's interesting things happening at the very end. It's not all about the initial sound.
Yep.
And so, this was an amazing playground to just foster that stuff. And I kind of, I almost think of it as I was writing it. I was thinking of it less as a soundtrack to a game because it's not so hand tailored to narrative moments. It really is just an album that then is sort of put in the game. That's how I think about it. And to me, I was describing it to people as the genre as, ambient industrial, right? Because it's very sparse and sort of washed out, but it's gritty and distorted and slightly unpleasant. Not all of it, but a lot of it is. And then I also learned in working on this through the person who mixed it and mastered it, a guy named Nathan Moody, who's a brilliant composer in his own right, and mix engineer and mastering engineer. He was sort of tapped into the real kind of industrial scene in the 90s and early 2000s. And he was telling me about a genre called power ambient, which I love. I love the idea of power ambient, which is maybe another level of intensity above this, but it's again cut from the same cloth. And I don't know. It was so nice to just finally release that pressure valve. Like, this kind of music is just in me, and I haven't had a public forum to kind of let it out. And I got to just go nuts with so many ideas that I've had for so long, where every track started, with a blank session, no templates, and just finger painting, and then sort of assembling it at the end. And that was really gratifying.
Absolutely. And also you were mentioning how like the pizzicato strings are such a touchstone sound for the earlier games, and you also said this is not a sequel of those games, but that by taking that out, so many of the attacks in your music for Firmament are so gentle. I mean, everything, and I loved that. It just felt very cared for, you know what I mean, in that way. Not that pizzicato strings don't sound like that. It's just a different vibe you get from it, right? When everything is just kind of, you're stepping into the room with dignity and grace with each attack, and I really loved that.
Yeah, I mean, you can think of it as musical erosion, right? Right. If the music is coming at you from a great distance, physically and temporally, then it's not going to be sharp, right? The same way mountains get worn down over time, or you grind your teeth down, or you know what I mean? All sorts of things like that, where it's all sort of filed off and sanded off and blurry, and sometimes you hear the echo first before the actual signal, and all that stuff. It's all just kind of jumbled up.
Yep, I loved that. So before we hit record, you mentioned that there was maybe one acoustic instrument in the whole thing. Now, I thought I heard some guitar, and maybe it was electric guitar, but I thought I heard some string movements at some point. So I don't know, maybe that was the instrument. But tell us about, what was the name of that instrument again from India?
Yes, it's called the Esraj, Esraj. And it almost looks like if you took a sitar and shrunk it down to about a quarter size. Okay. But then you played it with a bow. Sure. And so it has all those things like the sympathetic strings running underneath it. But you really only, it has multiple strings, but you really only play one, and everything else is either droning or resonating as you play. Oh, nice. And it has those, huge round frets, truly just like a sitar. But the body has, let me see if I can, let me grab it. This won't be great for the audio listeners, but for the video watchers, it might be cool.
Yeah. Do it.
If I fall in the background, you can just edit that out.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
Yeah, it does look like a little tiny sitar.
Yeah, so I did break a string on it, which changing the strings on these is not easy, so it will remain broken for quite some time. But the body is almost a gourd-like shape, and it has a skin covering it, kind of like a banjo. Yeah. And then it has these 4 strings, but again, you really only play the top one. It's definitely not in tune, so I won't play it. And then all of these crazy amount of tuning pegs, these are all the sympathetic strings.
Oh my. And
so between the membrane head on the body and the sympathetic strings, it has kind of a built-in reverb almost.
Right. Yep.
And once I heard it, it's a sound that I was like, oh, I've heard that before, and I always thought it was just a weirdly recorded violin, right? Because when you watch people play it, they're so fluid. I mean, I can't play it as fast, but not just physically bending it, but the speed with which they move around the neck is unbelievable. And I realized I'd heard that sound for years in Indian music recordings and Beatles songs even, right, that use Indian instruments. And I just thought it was like, oh, they recorded this, and this is my total cultural bias, and please forgive me, but I was like, oh, they just don't have as good equipment to record it, so they use some weird mic and crappy tape, and then just buried it in reverb. But it's not. It's kind of just the way it sounds. So it's a beautiful instrument, and it's only on one track, and it's just thoroughly mangled with sound effects, but it's in there.
Which track did you put it on?
It's on processing. It's that thing that kind of is, it's the lead line, and I don't think it's doubled with anything. Okay. But it is thoroughly mangled with a bunch of effects. Cool. And then the other, so as I was saying this, there's 2 acoustic instruments, but it's kind of it's a trick. So the other one is this thing. Yeah. Which is called either a Yuhiko or a Yohiko. It's a Finnish fiddle. And there's a similar version from Norway called tagelharpa, which is sort of a Viking type instrument, slightly different body construction and one extra string. But these are wound horsehair, so they're very, and then the bow is horsehair, so it's just like super scratchy, gnarly sounding. And that one is on let's see, Deep in the Mines. But I didn't play it. I recorded it and made a contact instrument of it. So it's still kind of a electronic instrument that's like been thoroughly it's doing things that you can't literally do on the actual instrument. Okay, cool. And then the string thing that you're hearing that's on a lot of tracks is the Fender Bass 6, which let me grab that off the wall.
Okay, yeah, do it.
Or I guess it's the Squire model,
as in
but
six strings.
But it's based on the original one. So in the 60s, Fender tried to make, I don't know if you can see that.
Oh yeah.
They tried to make, well, they did. They made a bass player for guitar players, or bass for guitar players, which is what I am. So it's long scale, almost like a baritone guitar, but it's a full octave below the guitar. You can't, if you try to play it like a guitar, that's kind of a mistake. You can play some chords on it, but because it's so low, that just turns to mush unless you're playing in higher registers. Yep. But it's sort of most famously used by John Lennon, and George Harrison played it on the Let It Be sessions whenever Paul was playing piano or acoustic guitar. So some of the videos you can see, or like in the recent Get Back documentary, when in the final sessions when they're playing live, not on the rooftop, but in the studio, you'll sometimes see John playing one of these. Oh, cool. And then Robert Smith used it a lot in the Cure. In fact, he used a black one that looked exactly like this. I was channeling a little bit of Robert Smith, but nice. But it's a great sound. And so the very first demo that I did for the studio, before I sent them 4 tracks that were like, here's some prototypes, and they're ranges of sound that we can go for on this, from kind of lightly processed to like extreme levels of processing, and 3 out of the 4 of those ended up in the game. One of them I withdrew. I was like, I like this too much, and no offense, but I want to turn this into like a personal project. And they said, okay. so stay tuned. That'll come out on something probably not related to a game at some point in the future. But the track, let's see, I think it's so the Glacial Realm, which is the second track on the album, has me playing harmonics on that thing.
Is that like there's like augmented stuff going on that you do?
Yes. I retuned it so that I could hit the melody that I wanted. Oh, cool. But actually played all harmonics. Nice. And then a couple times I play behind the bridge, right? Like, so, let me see. It's not tuned properly, but at the end I play back here, Yep. Oh, cool. Yep. And again, it's a wash in effects, but when I sent it to them, the creative director, Eric Anderson, was like, oh my God, he's like, this sounds like music that is being made on, high tension wires. And I love that sound. It was the first thing he really responded to very sort of strongly. Oh, cool. And that was my entry point. That was like, going back to what we were talking about earlier, I have the Mist keyboard. I had this idea of the Voyager gold record and all that stuff. But when he said music that's being made on high tension wires, I thought, great. That's a great sort of summary of what this should sound like. And so let me follow that thread. So that that instrument, the Bass 6, appears on the most tracks because it kind of sets the tone for the very first map that you see. Yeah. Talk to me about the all of the open intervals, and, if there's a melodic line of any kind, it's usually unison, or if it's harmonized, it's in these open like fourths and fifths. Can you talk to me a little bit about that? Sure. That stuff comes out a lot in the third map. So I try not to spoil anything again, but there's, as you progress through it, there's one of the last maps that you're in. They wanted it to sort of settle down from the chaos. There's maybe I can talk about this. This is not a huge spoiler, I don't think. there's three sort of primary maps. There's one, there's the glacial, they call them realms, the glacial realm. There's the, oh my gosh, I'm being put on the spot. There's, oh, what is it called? Well, I'll just describe them. So there's a glacier area. There's an area that is like industrial and sort of there's these pools of sulfur that you see these huge sort of mechanisms and industrial structures coming out of. And then there's, I think it's called orchard. So that's more like a conservatory, a very sort of lush organic space. And so as you progress through those areas, they wanted it to go from cold and icy and spiky to then like almost like you're licking a battery. That's kind of what the sulfur one is like. It's sort of buzzy and electric and nasty sounding. And then the orchard one is they wanted it to be warm and spacious and inviting. So there's a challenge of doing that with electronic instruments because they're not inherently sort of warm in the stereotypical sense. But that's where a lot of those open intervals come into play. You hear those most in that particular level because it just it allows again like the effects to fill in the gaps. But those open fourths and fifths is just sort of it's a very calming set of intervals. And then you can kind of just, this is obviously something that Debussy discovered 150 years ago. You can just kind of like, they sort of exist on the outside of any key. They just kind of are there and you can mix and match and they can just sort of stack in any way you want them and kind of just sound good, right? You don't have to worry about the rules of Western harmony based on major this and minor that. Right. So yeah, I thought that was a good an opportunity to explore that kind of tonality for that particular area.
Loved it. There's a track toward the end, I think it is, called "Echoes of Past Futures," and I really love how you're creating percussion without using percussion, right? So tell me about that aspect of it, because even that track right away starts off with something rhythmic, but it's not a percussion instrument. Yeah.
Let me I think I know what you're talking about. Let me just take a listen.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. That one was a lot of fun. So this is so tough to not spoil it, but it makes sense for where you're at in the game. The level of technology that you're going to encounter. I have some of that stuff physically, right? So that was one where it had to have energy, but it had to call back to a very specific period of time in 20th century music. So it's the most kind of intentionally retro sounding. Oh, cool. Even though, it's not a pastiche. I don't think it's not like I don't want to. I'm not trying to replicate John Carter, or John Carpenter. Maybe I'm trying to replicate John Carter on Mars. But I'm using some analog synthesizers, which are just kind of off camera here. And then the percussion aspect was a thing where I forget what the initial sound was, but I love the idea of taking percussive sounds and then applying delay to them and just tweaking the feedback, and timing of it all until you get a percussion track. So even though it sounds like a constant rhythm, it's really just like one hit on a downbeat every measure. And then all the other stuff that's ping-ponging back and forth is just the delay happening.
Love that.
And then it's run through this amazing plugin, which I wish I had one of these physically, but there's an experimental electronic artist, and he's a very popular YouTuber over the last couple of years, a German guy named Hainbach, Hainbach. And if you're into ASMR, I'm not, but he has this amazing sort of low resonant, very soft German accent voice. And he very calmly explains all this amazing stuff. And he was an inspiration in the sense that a lot of his music is based on buying old electronics test equipment that happened to generate sound. So his studio is filled with all these amazing old like tube things with huge dials and stuff from the 50s and like old weird Soviet synths and radio equipment, stuff that's not designed to make music. And then he just takes it all, manipulates it, and cool. A lot of times will record stuff to tape and makes amazing music. So he has a series of plugins that he's released one of which is called the Gong amp. And this is a real thing. And then they physically modeled it for the plugin. But basically, it's literally a gong about, maybe 18 inches in diameter. And, it's set up. I'm probably getting this wrong, so forgive me, but it's set up so that you run sound through it as if it's, instead of a speaker cone vibrating, it's this gong vibrating. And it adds that metallic, sheen and reverb to, and all those crazy overtones to the original sound. And so and then you can do things like muffle it with a pillow to deaden the decay time. You can hang chains in front of it so that as it vibrates, it rattles on the gong. So all that stuff is modeled in this plugin. And that's why that clanging sounds so metallic, is because I'm running it through that plugin.
Oh, cool.
Anyway, that's what's going on there. But yeah, that was the only one that really needed to drive. The moment in the story that it's happening and the area that you're at, it all makes sense, but it needed to start pushing you forward and get your heart pumping.
Mm-hmm. So, you mentioned how writing music like this is just intrinsically you, like it just kind of flows from you, and you kind of implied on, maybe releasing something. I mean, has this kind of sparked a desire in you to just create more music like this for the sake of creating more music like this?
Yeah, I have a few things that are kind of in the can that I'm waiting for the right time to release, and I have to, like anything, I got to just sit down and spend a month finishing 2 or 3 things, and waiting for that magical day when I'll have the time to do that, or instead of making the time. Yeah. But yeah, it's my this life and career, I'm very lucky to do it, and then like anything, that if you get known for, especially in a creative field, you get asked to do that over and over again. And look, the answer is always yes. If somebody comes to me and says, we'd love you to do this because we heard this one thing you've already done, are you available? Yes, of course I am, because I want to keep doing this for a living.
Yeah.
And I'm very happy. And I've actually been very lucky to mostly avoid writing on types of projects or writing types of music that I don't like. Things like, commercial jingles or trailer music, stuff that is fine, but other people can do that, and that's not my path. Yeah. So I've been lucky to do that, but eventually, as a creative person, you do want some variety. My background before getting into big, grand orchestral writing for Guild Wars was being in bands and producing music that way. And then I sort of shunned that specifically because I prefer to just kind of work alone. I'm not a group work kind of guy. So I like to mostly work alone, and I like collaborating. But when it comes down to actually working on something, I'd rather just be alone in my room with all my toys.
Yeah.
And so orchestral writing rewards that, but it's only one outlet, and you don't always get the opportunity to do it live, which is sort of how you get to execute it at the highest level. But with this kind of music, I can do it all, right? And so I did it all for the most part last year on Salt and Sacrifice with a couple of additional soloists, but for the most part that was made here, just me doing it on my own. And this one is 100% on my own. And maybe that's the first time I've ever put out anything. I think it is. This might be the first time I've ever put out any sort of release where it was 100% me from top to bottom. And it did sort of stir something in me where I was like, I can just do this. And maybe it doesn't have to be a 20-track album, it could be a 6-track EP. Like, who cares? Just put it out there. And once I'm sort of free of the constraints of having to write for a project, or what in my mind used to be like, if you're going to put out music with a band, you got to write songs. I wouldn't say I'm a great songwriter. So I felt if I'm doing that alone, I feel hamstrung by my inability to kind of, write songs the way I want them to be written. But this kind of thing, I can just crank it out. And there's people doing that, right? Like Heinbach is a guy that does that. Or Nathan, the guy who mastered the album and mixed it, he puts out 2 or 3 of these kinds of things a year. There's a woman named Lisa Belladonna, who's also kind of an influencer in the synth community. But she's an unbelievable keyboardist and electronic musician and an advocate for electronic music. And she just cranks albums out. And I'm like, what's stopping me, So the answer is nothing. The answer is me. And I think that, it sort of crystallized that thought in my head where I don't have to wait for people to come to me, especially because I do have work that pays the bills. So why not just kind of, make something for my own sake when I have some downtime? And so I think there'll be more of that in the future. It might not be as extreme as some of this stuff. But, I really like this kind of music, and I need an outlet for it. So there'll be more coming.
Yeah. How do you, if I may ask, kind of balance your work-life situation? Do you keep pretty strict hours of I'm working in the studio Monday through Friday, and then my weekends are mine to do all the other things I need to do to survive as an adult? I mean, how does that play out for you?
Yeah, it is that. So the reason, it is sort of 9 to 5. The reason I'm in this studio that I'm in currently was because for years I was working from home, and realized that I had started to. It happens slowly, right? Where you start to develop bad habits.
Yeah, you start to get a little weird.
Yeah, and I was initially, when I first started doing it, after years of commuting and working in offices, even when I was getting into games, in my civilian life pre-games, I was working in offices or retail or working at grocery stores and things. And then I got a job in games, and I thought, wow, this is amazing. And so, there's a long honeymoon period where you don't mind the commute and you want to go to the office because there's creative energy and excitement. You get to see your friends. And after many years of that, when I was physically working in the office at ArenaNet when I was living in Seattle, and I took over the music. Music requires you to go so far inside that a pin drop becomes a distraction. At least for me. And so the commute was a distraction. I was in a mostly, a treated room, but not soundproof, so I could hear people talking outside. Somebody comes by, knocks on the door, and says, "Hey, let's get lunch." All just completely breaks your concentration.
Yeah.
And so then I would stay there really late just because I would wait for people to leave and then start working on something at 5 or 6 p.m., which is also not healthy. So when I first started working from home, I thought, this is amazing. Like, I could just roll out of bed, make a cup of coffee, and then immediately start working, 20 minutes after I get up.
Yeah.
And I can work as long as I need to. And then when I'm done, I'm home and I can relax. And that was good for a while. But yeah, eventually it becomes, well, I'm not going to take a shower today, or I'm not going to get dressed, or I'm working, but let me just get up and make lunch or get a snack real quick, or check Facebook, or so what was happening. And then I always try to have dinner with my wife when I can, and then she would get home, so I would start to panic and be like, I got to clean up the house a little bit, and you're doing chores, and I sit down and have dinner, and they say, I just got to finish this one thing after dinner. It'll only take me half an hour. And that turns into, you're at the computer until midnight. And it was that endless sort of cycle. And 6 hours of work would take 12 hours in sitting at the computer, right?
Yeah.
So eventually I just decided I got to get out, and I need to treat this like a job, not rob it of the joy that I feel getting to write music every day. But I have to sort of add some structure to this, and have a place where I go, and when I'm there I'm working, and when I leave I'm not, and that's worked out really well.
Yeah. One of the things that changed for me when I started working much more from home, and this is such a stupid simple thing, was but in terms of breaking concentration, I had to put everything on Do Not Disturb. And now I'm on it more than I'm off it, probably.
Yeah.
Just to make sure I can stay focused.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, back to Firmament. We've talked about how this is really your style and all of, intrinsic to the way you compose. Did you, in terms of just, we talk about melody so much, and the absence of it is not, it's not a I know I'm not enunciating this very well, but it's not a negative thing to not have melody. Is it a difficult thing to not have melody? That was a terrible question, but you know what I'm not asking. I even have it written down. But is it did you struggle with at all putting in ideas and then saying that's too much?
No, again, because to me, there is a lack of sort of continuous melody, right? There's nothing that's probably even 2 measures or 4 measures, certainly.
Right.
But there's always at least a little hook or some sort of thread that is carried throughout all of them.
Yes.
But Yeah, I don't know. It's like I said, it's sort of, it all starts with a blank session, an empty session with nothing saved, no presets, no templates, nothing. And I play around until I find a hook that works for me. So every one of these tracks has at least that, and whether other people pick up on that or not, is not for me to decide.
Yeah.
But yeah, everything started with at least some semblance of an idea that I could then say this is the core of this track, and then I'll build around it. And that could be I'm trying to think of a particular example. There's one track on here that is actually let me see if I can remember it. It's I found my old audition tape for when I applied to Berklee College of Music.
Wow.
And I have a box full of tapes that I haven't thrown out. And then, but I didn't have a way to play them for a long time because I had gotten rid of the 4-track that I used to have as a kid, which I should have kept it because it'd be worth a lot of money these days. But I ended up buying a replacement to be able to digitize some of these old tapes that I had. And I was just going through them, and at one point I found this audition tape, and it's I listened to it now. And I'm like, they let me in that school playing this tape, I hope that the standards are a little higher, but it's me just running through some scales and running through some solo guitar pieces to just prove to them that I could play. I think if I'm piecing this together properly, I think that I applied and I asked my guitar teacher at the time for a letter of recommendation. And I think he might have been honest on it, which was basically like, Maclaine is talented, but doesn't like to practice. So maybe doesn't have some of the initiative that he should have, which is still very true. At least with guitar, I hate practicing.
Yeah.
But they asked me to put together this tape with, sort of shopping list of items that had to be on there. So I did, and I got in. Anyway, the rest is history, and here I am. But I was listening to it, and I grabbed, there's one part where there's an original piece on there. So some of it was like solo guitar arrangements of like jazz standards and things like that, doing that where you're playing the voice leading and the bass line at the same time. And then one of them is an original piece, and it's all tons of harmonics and stuff like that. And I thought, oh, this sounds cool. So I digitized it, and then I took that little like 3 seconds of it where there's just a bunch of cool things happening all at once, but it sounds, it's a 25-year-old tape. And is all warbly and low fidelity and stuff. And then I literally stretched it as far as the computer would allow me. And eventually it was like, you can't, you've reached the limits of what this piece of software can do. You have to stop. So, but I wanted to hear both the music stretched out that far, and then also the digital artifacts that come along with that.
Sure.
And, to me, so then, that's not a melody. It's not even a motif, like a melodic idea, but it's an idea, and then the music is built around that. So let me find which one that is.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not truthfully, I'm not entirely sure which one it is, but one of these tracks has that as the foundation of it. Maybe it's the Spire. Anything where there's, oh God, it could be anything. Anyway, there's other tracks that use a similar idea of taking something and stretching it to the absolute breaking point. And I would say most of the first probably 5 or 6 tracks have that as some sort of synth pad foundation, and where it's not tonal. It's just it's warbly and it's in between notes, and just it sets a type of semi-musical drone. But then what I wanted to talk about was in Frozen Footsteps.
Yeah.
I had this, I put together a video. If you sort of track it down on my Instagram account, it's there from I don't know, maybe 6 or 8 months ago. The hook of that one was me just being like, what can I do how do I start this track in a non-musical way? And I took this device, which I bought off of Etsy from an account called Electro Lobotomy. And it's this guy that just makes weird noise instruments. So it's 2 springs.
Oh, cool.
That are roughly, they're different sizes and different pitches, I guess. They're not really a pitch, but they sound different. And then it has these knobs, one of which is a volume knob and one of which is a bias knob. And you can sort of like, I know nothing about electronics, but you can turn it to the point where it's just barely getting enough electricity to amplify the sound. So it'll start to crackle and sort of break up a little bit. And it's it's basically like a spring reverb. Like you can shout into it. It's electric. You plug it in. you can shout into it and it sounds like you're shouting into a guitar pickup or a spring reverb or something like that. But it's so noisy on purpose. It's designed so that like just even physically touching this box part of it will make so much noise when it's plugged in. And it's over there, so I can't grab it at the moment. But I have a dust buster in the studio, and I just turned it on and I ran it over it, and so you hear the like whirr of it, but through these springs.
Wow!
And then I also was just like banging it on it, and it makes so much noise when you bang it because you have to amplify it significantly to get any sound out of it. So when you touch it, it's like it just sounds like the world is ending. And so in that track, I mean, if you know that that's what I'm doing, hitting a spring with a dust buster, you could 100% hear it in the track. But
that's the Frozen Footsteps one?
Frozen Footsteps, yeah.
Okay.
So that's the hook on that one. So, you know, like I said, there's at least some essence of an idea that's the starting point. And it doesn't have to be like, I have this great melody I have to get out. Because I think they specifically... to fully answer your question, the studio said we don't with most of the music except for that one track, the Echoes of Past Futures, we don't want to be able to sense any sort of rhythm, and we don't even necessarily want it to be like chord to chord to chord to chord. They wanted it to be super droney, super stretched out. So it was partially my own ideas, but starts with the creative direction from the studio. So anytime I felt like I was veering off into that territory, because as a pop background guy, I love writing a little tune, I had to figure out ways to break that habit. And sometimes it was, digitizing my old teenage self playing guitar, and sometimes it was instead of using the dustbuster to clean my studio, which you could definitely use, it was smashing it into springs.
I love that. Batteries Casting Shadows is a track that has some kind of instrument taking the lead in terms of being that hook or whatever. Can you tell me a little bit about that sound and that track?
Oh yeah, this one's cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so again, I wish I could show you, but I have this. I bought this specifically for this project, but it was something that I've been looking for an excuse to buy to buy it for years. I have a synthesizer called the Hawken Continuum, and I encourage people to Google it, and maybe you can on the video you can flash a picture of it. But it's made by a professor called Lippold Hawken. That's his name, Haken, and the instrument is called the Continuum. So he teaches electronic music at University of Illinois, either Urbana or Champaign, one of those schools, but somewhere in Illinois. So, starting back in the 80s or the 90s, he's a really fascinating guy. I think he's kind of like a genius, and he's also sort of a classic kind of nerd, like the kind that looks like he's got a pocket protector and a slide rule in it. I mean, truly, but a genius. And he started his desire was to make a keyboard or an electronic synthesizer instrument that would allow you to have the level of expression that a violin has. Because I think the story is either he was a violin player as a kid or his brother was. And, keyboard-based instruments, which in the 60s and 70s were this amazing revelation. And that was that was what made the most sense in terms of how to get notes out of the electronics, was just, basically on off, but using a musical input device that was familiar to people. But then it got kind of stagnant, right? Like synthesizer development sort of reached an apex in the 80s and then has been sort of frozen in time, right? And the most interesting stuff has been on the software side. But the input device, people tried to figure out ways to get guitars to do it, or your voice or something. But it always feels a little weird, and there was nothing that was better than a keyboard. So he spent his life's work has been to produce an instrument that would allow you to add that level of expression. And so the Hawken Continuum, if you look at it, the surface of it has these alternating kind of red and black stripes that are laid out the same way a piano keyboard are in terms of black and white keys.
Okay.
But instead of the black keys being shorter than the white keys, the stripes go fully across the touch surface. Okay. And the surface itself is made. It makes so much sense if you could see the image. So forgive me for having to be overly descriptive, but
no, please. Yeah.
And I can't. It's too big for me to physically show you on camera.
It's all good.
So the surface itself is made out of neoprene, which is like wetsuit material.
Yeah.
And the underneath it is extremely complex electronics, springs and sensors and things. And so the idea is that you can control the synthesizer. You can change notes and change parameters of the synthesizer by moving left to right on the x-axis, right?
Yes.
So lower, higher, whatever. The y-axis, so up and down. But then also you can press down into it, so the z-axis, right? And
sure.
That level of just that addition of expression, X and Y stuff has been around on other fingerboard type controllers for a while, but that aspect is like opens up this whole different world. And then on top of that, originally it was just a controller for a third-party synthesizer software. Then he partnered with some other people to produce a proprietary synth engine, which is so unbelievably complicated that I only use presets on it because I need like a decade to learn how to program this thing. But the presets sound amazing. So it has its own internal engine. It's like a self-contained instrument. And what, in talking to people that use it, and I sort of was dealing with like an intermediary who was not really the salesman, but a friend of Lippold that could sort of broker it, that lives local in LA. Okay. He was telling me that, people who approach this as, piano players that come at this and say, oh, it looks like a piano, I know how to play that, actually have struggled the most with it. And it's people who are used to making music with their hands. So I'm a guitar player. And even though, this thing is fretless, in a sense, but I'm used to fretted instruments, the idea of adding expression with my left hand is second nature to me. So when I sit down to play it, I'm not approaching it like a piano. I'm approaching it like almost like I would a guitar if I was laying it flat. And the idea of adding that level of expression, vibrato going left to right, and the most subtle amount of pressure will change the sound. It's unbelievable. So that sound that you hear playing, and the fact that it does these crazy like portamento jumps, like jumping up 2 octaves, that's me just sliding my finger around on this fingerboard.
Oh wow.
And I think that one has very minimal additional effects on it, because the effects in the synth engine that it runs are actually pretty good. And even that level of buzzy sort of distortion is just built into the sound. It might have some extra reverb on it or something like that. But yeah, that was one that I almost wrote. Some of these I wrote like kind of in real time. It's sort of easy with a drone, where you just sort of like lay down 2 minutes of something and then start noodling and say, I think that's good. So that one was one where I had an idea of a melodic shape, and then I just kind of kept developing it. So anyway, that very long explanation, but that's what that is. So the Hawken Continuum, unbelievable instrument, feels like maybe the first real breakthrough in new instrument technology, probably since, I would say, the original synthesizers, Moog and Oberheim and Buchla and all that whole crew.
Amazing. And that's Batteries Casting in Shadows. Really cool sound. I really liked that.
Thanks.
Well, Maclaine, what else do you want to say about Firmament or the process of composing it? I'm
trying to think. There's, one thing I really tried to do on this one was it came at a time where I had the luxury of time. I had just finished up the last Guild Wars 2 expansion and Salt and Sacrifice, which was a mad dash to get to the finish line of that. And then all of a sudden my schedule was kind of free and clear.
Nice.
And that was when this came along, and I had about a 6 or 7 month period where I just had to write, an hour ish of music. It's not quite an hour, actually, 45, 50 minutes. And I thought, well, what if I did this the slow way, right? Rather than, I've been so rushed on these last couple projects. What if I just did this differently? And so I have all these hardware synths. Great. So much of what I did was physically play them in like an acoustic instrument. And if I didn't get it right, I would hit stop, hit undo, and just play it in again. When you're working with MIDI and software and stuff like that, it's so easy to just get everything to line up perfectly. But I wanted it to be electronic music with, just some imperfections in there. And then I also, for the effects, I wanted to use a lot of hardware effects instead of plugins. And there's no shortage of plugins, believe me. But I have a couple. I had this idea of, I'm really trying not to spoil the story, but this idea of snapshots of technology through time, and how that applies to the story of the game and how I could make the music reflect that. So, I have new synthesizers, I have vintage synthesizers, I have new outboard effects, like rack mount effects. I have vintage ones. And so I'm using all of those and trying to let their imperfections shine through. So whether it's like some low bit rate thing that, again, you hear all the sort of aliasing up in the high frequencies, or there's the VIP or the MVP of this soundtrack is a box called the Eventide Harmonizer, right? And so the Eventide is, they're still around. They're still making both plugins and guitar pedals and processing units and stuff, but they started to appear in the 70s. They're all over those early Brian Eno records and the records that he did with David Bowie, the so-called like Berlin trilogy. And there's a lot of quotes of them talking about how they had this amazing box and how they sort of discovered it and how the sound of those records was all in this Eventide. And it was so futuristic sounding then. And now it sounds a little bit quaint because, we're 45 years on. But I still see the sort of pinnacle of them was this model that came out in the 80s called the H3000. That's sort of the most desirable model. I got my hands on one. Nice. I still see, I'll see pictures of people's studio setups, or YouTube videos or something now. And they're instantly recognizable because they have a huge dial and a number pad on them. And I see them in people's racks all the time. And I thought, well, let me just see what it can do that plugins can't do. And there's one setting on there called stutter, which this is again, so apologies for the long explanation, but I find this stuff interesting, and hope maybe one other person will. Or two. You'll find it interesting, but maybe a third person will. There's a sort of semi-viral YouTube video out there called like worst guitar player ever. Let me look it up here.
Okay.
Worst guitar player ever. Okay, so just Google or go to YouTube and type in worst guitar player or worst guitarist ever, Henry Kaiser. That's the name of this video. It's been on YouTube for 10 years. It has 1.3 million views.
Okay,
and it's this guy. It's a snapshot of a longer video of him just demoing his guitar playing and some of his interesting effects and stuff. He's like an avant-garde experimental guitar player for sure.
Okay.
And this is just a short snapshot of it. And when I heard it, I get why they sort of memeified it or tried to make it into a joke because it sounds weird, but that's the whole point. But when I heard it, I was like, I know exactly what he's doing. It's this one setting on this Eventide.
Cool.
And so he has it in addition to the stutter effects, it also randomly pitch it. It's all random. So what it'll do is you play into it. Whatever the electronics do will sort of like randomly grab a snapshot, put it in its memory buffer, and then make completely random stutter sounds, and then also randomly pitch shift it down at, the length of time of the pitch shift is random. The interval is completely random. And he's like playing blues licks into it and it sounds like a nightmare. Right. But I found that effect. I was like, oh my God, it's that sound. I'd been using it a little bit. And I was like, he's doing the same thing I'm doing. I was like, I'm on the right track. So that stutter, anytime you'll hear it in moments on some of the tracks, but I used it on, I would say maybe half or 2/3 of the tracks. And mostly on the melody, when you hear it, you always hear it at the very end. Like I said, when a note plays out, I want you listening the whole time. So as it starts to die away, you might hear sort of like a sort of grabbing the sound, and it doesn't sound like it's just being chopped up in a rhythmic way. It's completely random. Now, having said all that, I used all that stuff, hardware synths, hardware processing. I have this is the treasure map here because I have pages and pages and pages of notes of settings of like on this track, I used preset number 236, except I changed this setting from this number to this number. And what I realized was that's why nobody uses hardware anymore. They all do it with software because when you get to the end of the process and you have to say export every track and send it to a mixer, well, in software, you open up the session and it's all right there the way you saved it the last time before you closed it. When it's hardware, you have to physically turn knobs. And so I have a million pictures on my phone of hardware settings and a million notes saying like, this is how I did this and this is how I did this. And that was almost a full-time job in and of itself. Was all the music was written, and then I had to take like 2-3 weeks to export everything and send it to the mixer. And I'd send him something and he'd be like, I think you've maybe forgot to say, I'm hearing something like this in the reference mix, but I'm missing that track. So I was like, oh, crap. And then I go back and redial it all up, and oh my God, it was such a nightmare. So I don't know if for a project, I don't know if I'll ever do that again. Maybe for my own personal work, I'll do it. Yeah. But yeah, I realized why in 2023 you can find some of this stuff very cheap because it's no longer desirable on a professional level.
Or efficient. Yeah.
Certainly not efficient. But again, like I said, I had the time. And then the last thing I'll say about it is and the end result is what it is. And could I have gotten there with all software and plugins and things? Sure. But in my mind, it's, the process is what draws things out of you creatively. I didn't want to feel like I was just on autopilot or, doing comfortable and familiar things. And for me, the final product is like 5, 10, 20% cooler than it would have been if I had done it all the easy way. And that to me is what is, as an artist or a creative individual, that to me is the whole point. I wanted this to feel unique and fully tailored to the game because it deserves it. And if I, believe that the studio is important, at least important to me, and the games they make are important. And I know that the studio has such a huge dedicated fan base that is so into what they do specifically. And, there needs to be space for that. And if they care enough to keep the studio afloat for so many years, then I have to care enough with the music.
I loved it. I think it's magnificent. I can't wait for the game. And I'm just grateful for another great conversation with you. Thanks so much, Maclaine.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. I was going to say, I'd like to say this on record, that, I appreciate that you dedicate so much of your time and energy to this, fostering the community. This idea of community is something that's been very important to me lately. And, we're so used to this. Ironically, this community is, the foundation of it is people sitting alone in a room. So having someone like you who, takes so much of their time to have conversations like this and connect people that are as passionate about it, I think is really important. So I just want to say thank you for doing this.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thanks, Maclaine.